So one of the biggest arguments against trickle-down economics is that it causes wealth inequality. So in this episode, we will discover what wealth inequality is and if it has negatives or even positives. So right here, I have the definition of a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game is basically a representation of a situation where if somebody wins something or if somebody gains something, it must be because somebody else lost something. So if I get $100, it's because you lost $100. Economics or economies don't work like that. They are not zero-sum games. Just because somebody is doing better than you doesn't mean it's because of your losses, and it doesn't mean that if they didn't have that success, you would be successful. So that's something that's really important to see. So the first thing we need to look at is the Gini Index. So the Gini Index measures inequality in the United States. So the higher the Gini Index, the more inequality. The lower the Gini Index, the lower the amount of inequality. So one of the arguments against inequality, wealth inequality, is it is tied to poverty, right? So the more wealth inequality there is, the more poverty there is. And that kind of makes sense. If there's people at the top 1% making billions and billions of dollars, then it would kind of make sense that those billions and billions of dollars could be used to get people out of poverty. But that's simply not the case. So as you can see, since 1968, the Gini coefficient has been steadily rising in the United States. It's never really gone down substantially. It's always been rising. But poverty since 1968 has gone down very steadily. It has gone down until around 1968. Then it has stayed level. And that was probably because of the Great Society, welfare programs. It hasn't fully gone down yet. But something really important to notice, this huge shift in income inequality has been tied to Reagan's policies in the 1980s that allowed much more of the rich to keep their money. But if we look at the 1990s, the poverty rate is not seeming to go up that much. It is actually lower than it was during 1959 and 1960. Yet, the Gini coefficient was actually lower in 1959 and 1960 than it is in 1990. So that's one argument that should never be used. Wealth inequality is definitely not tied to poverty. So why is there wealth inequality? So this is actually from Demos, a left-leaning policy institute, and they actually kind of go against themselves in this article. So the mean wealth by age is a steadily increasing bar, and this kind of makes sense. If you're really young, like let's say you're 18 or 22 or below age 35, you've probably just started working. You're out of college. You're probably in debt from college loans. But let's say you're 65. Well, then you spent your entire life working and saving money. So a huge driver of wealth inequality isn't this kind of idea that the rich are one separate group from the poor. Well, the poor can definitely become rich as age goes on. So there are definitely more rich individuals that are older in the country than are younger, but that's because they have built their whole life on making money. And another thing is that the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. Absolutely not true. So 70%, and this is from Time, this 70% of rich families lose their wealth by the second generation. And when it says lose their wealth, it means completely lose all of the money that the previous generation had made. So this idea that millionaires and billionaires are just, they keep being millionaires and billionaires, and that idea of the 1% being like this kind of restricted area that only like the elite can be into. No, that's absolutely not true, because income mobility in the country is extremely high thanks to capitalism. So, and this is just for the second generation. What about the third generation? As much as 90% of rich families lose their wealth by the third generation. So this idea that if you're lucky enough to have a father, a grandfather, or a great-grandfather that if they do well, then you'll just do well. It's completely not true. People have to go out and earn their money. And this idea that, and the opposite idea works as well. If rich people can drop out of the top 1%, then people, normal Americans, can get into the top 1%. So this is a graph from Carpe Diem, and it's been published by the AEI. So 73% of Americans have been in the top 20% for at least 1 year of their lives. 56% of Americans have been in the top 10% for 1 year. 39% have been in the top 5%, and 12% have been in the top 1%. Now, this is really, truly stunning because 73% of Americans, you wouldn't think that 73% of Americans are gotten to the top 1% for at least 1 year. Definitely not 56%. I mean, those are huge numbers. And this idea that, and it really destroys the idea that the top 1% is this kind of restricted area, because it's simply not true. 73% of Americans have been in the top 20% of income earners in this country. So this idea that the top 1% is this separate group from the middle class and the poor, totally not true. And there's also this idea that billionaires don't make their own money, that it's all because of their privilege of being born into rich families. Well, according to Forbes, which has the Forbes 400 most wealthy Americans in the United States, over 69% of those 400 billionaires and millionaires, they made their own fortunes. So they didn't get it from their dad or their mom or their grandfather or their grandmother. They made it themselves. And there's also this idea that the poor are really having it bad in this country. Now, of course, being poor in this country is a terrible thing, and getting people out of poverty is always a good thing, whether it be extreme poverty or soft poverty. But there seems to be this idea that they're struggling to survive, but that's not true. The Heritage Foundation, Robert Rector, a great economist, he found that 80% of poor households have air conditioning in the United States. And to think that just a couple of decades before, in 1970, only 36% of the entire U.S. population had air conditioning. All of it. 92% of poor households have a microwave. Almost all of them have trucks or cars. As you can say, 75% have a car or truck. 31% have 2 or more cars or trucks. Nearly 2/3 have cable or satellite TV. 2/3 have one DVD player. Half have a personal computer. More than half have a video game system. 43% have internet access. A third have a widescreen plasma or LCD TV, and a fourth have a digital video recorder system. So this idea that the poor really have it bad in this country, it's absolutely not true. Now, of course, if you were to compare a poor person to a middle-class person, then of course, this idea, the poor person obviously is going to be viewed as the one in the worst situation. But to think that the people in poverty in the United States are at the same level of poverty in places like North Korea or China or in Africa, it's absolutely not true. And also, what are the benefits of wealth inequality? Now, I've been debunking a lot of the myths about the negatives of wealth inequality, but what is a positive? So right here, this is from, I believe, it's a paper about wealth inequality. Yes, it's from the E21 report. So inequality does not reduce prosperity. So a really important graph that I need to show is right here. So as inequality increases, the share of the market income going to the top 1%, that's the x-axis, as that is increasing, as wealth inequality is increasing, what is happening to the middle class living standards? It's increasing. They are positively correlated. So yes, living standards and GDP growth is actually increasing thanks to wealth inequality rather than decreasing. So hopefully you learned a lot in this video, debunking some of the myths about wealth inequality, and I hope you learned a lot. More videos will be on the way. Thank you.